What makes Metroid Prime 2 Echoes interesting right off the bat is the fact that it's a sequel to a game that without hyperbole defined its era. Say what you will about Prime 1, and I have, but I can't argue that it was an astoundingly avant-garde title, a killer app that single-handedly turned Metroid from a well-regarded cult series into one of Nintendo's biggest franchises. By 2004, AAA franchises like this were becoming increasingly reliant on consistent, like bi-yearly or even yearly releases. Previous Metroid games were released generations apart on increasingly more powerful hardware. Therefore, no two games had ever been especially similar. The series reinvented itself with each release, not just iterating, but evolving. Metroid Prime 2, on the other hand, was coming out only 2 years after the original, on the same hardware, in the same engine. But unlike movies or TV spin-offs, video game sequels have a pretty positive track record. Sequels often give developers the opportunity to iron out the kinks, refining and polishing an excellent predecessor into an even better sequel. Metroid itself had already done this earlier in the year, using the same engine from Metroid Fusion to make an excellent remake of the NES original. And given that Prime 1 was so well received, that much of a system seller, that important of a game, imagine what Retro Studios would be able to achieve with one more iteration. The anticipation was off the charts! Or so you'd think. But when I think of the weeks before Metroid Prime 2's release, I don't remember a lot of hype. What I remember is a short span of time where the consoles the Gamecube competed with received some of the most highly anticipated sequels I had ever seen. I remember my friends talking about Halo 2 for months on end, and even skipping school the day it came out. I remember them lavishing praise on how astounding the expanse of San Andreas was, sharing stories of their criminal escapades. And when Metroid Prime 2 came out, well, probably just read that Nintendojo liked it. This lack of hype was even stranger considering that the only contemporary console I had at the time was the Gamecube. And even though the first game had failed to make me a Metroid fan, I did my due diligence as a Nintendo fan. I rented Echoes, played it for an hour or two, and lost interest. Second verse, same as the first, I thought. All I really recall about it was that it was very brown. Which was ironic because Prime 2 failed to kick up any dust. But what happened? Was the long shadow cast by Prime 1 that impossible to overcome? Did the fact that it was on the Gamecube cause it to be ignored, since by this time the system's sort of kiddie reputation was solidified? Perhaps I, as a high school student at the time, was in the wrong environment to encounter appreciation for it. Maybe that is a piece of it, but even now I don't hear much about Echoes. It's like it's got middle child syndrome. The first one is legendary, the third one is controversial, but Metroid Prime 2 shares a similar fate to the other game in this series with a 2 in the title. It has often been overlooked in favor of its contemporaries, and I cannot wait to find out why. Let's get critiquing. Okay, well that's weird. I guess multiplayer must be the primary mode of this game, since it is highlighted first on the main menu. God, what is even going on with this interface? Prime 1 was slick, but this is trying so hard to be futuristic that it crosses over into being impractical. Whatever. It's been a long time, but I remember how to do multiplayer games on this channel. Kaylin, how many great memories do you have of playing the multiplayer mode of this game with all of your friends?
0. I got you this.
Did you just uppercut me? Alright, Kaylin, that was Metroid Prime 2 multiplayer. What's your critique?
It's alright. It's like playing GoldenEye, but without slappers. Which makes it to where it's not like playing GoldenEye.
Playing GoldenEye, but without slappers. You know, there's probably a reason Let's Plays didn't work out for us back in the day. It's odd to see the isolationist Metroid series even try multiplayer, but it turned out to be a lot more fun than I was expecting. Problem was, 2004 was kinda this origin point for online shooters on consoles. Prime 2 split-screen exclusive couch gaming was never gonna have much staying power, and so it comes across like Nintendo was just trying to keep up appearances. Regardless of what the menu implies, the real game is still the single player. Metroid Prime 2 immediately drives a hard distinction between itself and its predecessor. That game began with Samus responding to a distress call and led into a half-hour-long, action-packed prologue that made an incredible first impression, but it wasn't really germane to what the rest of the game would be about. Prime 2 starts with a mystery. Samus is tasked with locating a squad of Galactic Federation Marines. Their last point of contact was the planet Aether, and on her descent through the atmosphere, Samus's gunship is struck down, crashing through the wall of the cave. That's as much action as you'll see for a little while. Instead of being explosive and cinematic, Echo's prologue is quiet. too quiet. There's a sense of trepidation as you push deeper into these twisting tunnels. As is tradition, the Federation Marines never stood a chance, their armored corpses strewn throughout the caves. Maybe it was this sense of danger the game was instilling, but I found myself inclined to do something I almost never do in games. I was taking my time. I was being careful. I was, and I'm almost ashamed to say it, scanning everything. The scan visor has been substantially improved. For starters, the HUD directly communicates what percentage of stuff you've scanned by categories, which is a lot nicer than fiddling with the menu. It's dumb, but it's fun to watch those numbers go up. More importantly though, instead of scannable stuff appearing as nodes, entire polygonal objects are highlighted. They're color-coded between critical stuff, items and bonus info, and things you've scanned already. This change might not seem like much, but it makes the visor so much more useful. It's so much more clear just what you're scanning, and it makes it a cinch to see exactly what's important as soon as you walk into a room. But there was probably another reason I was inclined to use the scan visor. I played Prime 1 with a mouse and keyboard via the Trilogy version, and I know I'll have to play Prime 3 with a Wii remote thanks to the more involved motion controls. So for Prime 2, I decided to go old school and play the Gamecube original, complete with the Gamecube controller. And I was not at all expecting this, but I found it to be more immersive. Mostly that came down to this. I no longer had to deal with this clunky cursor movement to change visors and beam types. The Trilogy controls do have a ton of benefits, but they kept awkwardly pulling me out of the game because of how often I had to interact with the interface. With a GameCube pad, those commands are only a button press or a flick of the C-stick away. The outmoded movement controls of the GameCube version are sure to be an issue for some people, but like I said last time, every console FPS I played when I was a kid controlled a lot like this, so it was like riding a bike to me. And as I played, I noticed that the game was very much designed around this controller. The gaming, the lock-on, the enemies, and the mechanics are all built to function optimally within the framework of the GameCube layout. But hey, that's just my preference. I prefer easy swapping over modern FPS controls, but I prefer them both if I could have them. Not being able to look up and move at the same time did become a problem in a few spots, so it'd be nice to get the best of both worlds. Nonetheless, I always did think that one of my big issues with Prime was the lack of free aim controls. But apparently not. The GameCube pad was always one of my favorites, and it's won me over again. But there was one more reason I found myself getting immersed right from the start. It's one thing to deal with a spectacular disaster that's unfolding while you're in the middle of it, but I think it's inherently more interesting and more evocative of Metroid to ask the player to figure out what's gone wrong after the fact. In one scenario, your adrenaline is pumping, but in the other, you're using your head. And of course, the ingredients of a great Metroid game feature plenty of both, but by kicking off with a mystery, Prime 2 is able to instill both its tone and what it expects from the player in a more immediate way. That apprehension gets kicked up another notch when the dead Marines get infected by some kind of particle effect and shamble at Samus like zombies. Then Prime 2 delivers on the promise of the previous game's cliffhanger ending, as Samus runs into a dark shadow of herself. She follows her doppelganger through a portal of sinister purple clouds, and then what? Well, Samus will strap on a water jetpack later, so maybe Nintendo was just going through a phase. But no, Samus comes through the portal and confronts her shadow. This dark Samus shoots out a crystal in a nicely cinematic moment, causing our heroine to choke on the very atmosphere of this place. Warped, twisted enemies vastly outnumber her, and she barely escapes back through the portal, only to find that the creatures harvested a bunch of her suit upgrades. Hey, that sure beats them getting knocked out by a dinky explosion. You still keep the Morph Ball and Charge Beam, so you're never down to that basic pea shooter. Samus soon discovers that the Marines were engaged in a battle with our old buddies, the Space Pirates. Both of them were caught in that same atmospheric storm. Both of them crash-landed, and the early part of the game nicely contrasts the Marines' experience with the Space Pirates as you discover the remains of both camps. The Marines were overpowered by swarms of splinters, the same that attacked Samus. It wasn't long before I fought an even larger splinter, and right when I had it on the ropes, it was corrupted by that dark energy and became even stronger. But I kept my wits about me, dodged its attacks with all my finesse, refined through decades of playing video games, and I died? Well, I never died a single time in Prime 1, but I just died to the first mini-boss in Echoes! This game is awesome! God, I love a challenge, and I love overcoming it even more. Then I picked up a thing, rode an elevator, and encountered a non-player character that's friendly? Like, we're just gonna have a conversation in a Metroid game? Well, okay. This is a member of an alien race called the Chozo? Wait, we're also introducing a sentient species that's not a Chozo? No, this is a Luminoth, and his name is Umos. Umos. He's gonna exposit the rest of the backstory. So, 50 years ago, Aether collided with some kind of celestial object, spreading a strange energy across the planet. Does any of that sound familiar? But in this case, the world was split into two. Light and dark. The Dark World manifested a new race, which the Luminoth called the Ing. Virus-like creatures capable of infecting Aether species with their malice, turning even the peaceful Luminoth into hosts for the Ing. For decades, they waged war on each other, the Ing successfully stealing away most of Light Aether's planetary energy. Now the light side is on the verge of ruin. But that thing Samus picked up from the Dark Splinter was the Luminoth's energy transfer module. It's become integrated into her suit, meaning she is now the only one who can travel into the Dark World, recover the planetary energy, and bring the light back to Aether. Whew, yeah, we've come a long way from just shattering boss statues. The first area to set out to is the Agon Wastes. And, are you sure I've even gone anywhere? The entire prologue is set in these dusty caves, and going out of those and into this drab wasteland means the opening hours of Echoes are way too aesthetically similar. Keeping you in this same kind of locale for so long means that for a while, Echoes lacks both the memorable contrast and the immediate breadth of its predecessor. But maybe Retro hoped that contrast would instead come from Echoes' overarching gimmick, the Dark World. The world is filled with portals that let you go back and forth between these two realities of Aether. Dark Aether is aesthetically fantastic, contrasting this dark palette with sinister purple highlights. While the overall geometry of most rooms stays the same across dimensions, the enemies and mechanisms that inhabit them tend to be completely different. It can be unnerving seeing these familiar areas corrupted. It does an excellent job instilling the feel that you're on enemy territory, exemplified by the fact that the atmosphere itself is corrosive. Samus burns off a ton of health anytime you leave these bubbles. The Dark World is not, however, all-inclusive. The Dark World maps tend to be dwarfed in size by the main maps, and sometimes you'll go ages without even going there. This keeps it from seeming like it's there to artificially lengthen the game by reusing the same geometry. It's implemented smartly and in a way that makes sense. It's also used for puzzle solving, activating a mechanism in one world to affect another, or even to travel to places that you can't get to yet on the other map. These lead to some really fun, unique puzzles that inspire outside-the-box thinking, but it can get a little ridiculous how many times you'll have to sit through the same loading transition. I don't think the tech was there to make it any snappier than this, though. We were still a few years away from thinking with portals. I was surprised when I found myself up against Dark Samus already, this early in the game. I was even more surprised at how, pitiful she was to dispatch. I mean, seriously, after all that buildup, have I beaten her already? Of course not. She'll show up throughout the game, let out this chilling, over-the-top laugh, and do something to inconvenience the player. Oh, wait a minute. A doppelganger, with similar powers to our hero, who keeps coming out of nowhere to screw up our progress? I love the concept, but haven't I seen this somewhere before? Oh yeah, duh. They even chuckle the same way. After kicking Dark Samus to the curb, you find the Dark Beam, and not too long after that, it's opposite in the Light Beam. If the Dark World is Echo's most distinctive thematic element, then its most distinctive gameplay element comes right here. Combat in Prime 1 was defined by the different beam types, and while they felt excellent, their actual implementation was too often based around repetitive color matching. The Dark and Light Beams, in contrast, are the only beam weapons you'll be getting for a long time, and introducing them so early was no accident. Like Prime's beams, they each have properties that give them unique utility, and the sound effects and timing on them are just as well designed, giving both of them a distinct kick. What makes the difference, though, is not Samus's abilities, but how much more dynamically designed and challenging her enemies are. Some of them may be weak to one beam or the other, but there's almost nothing in the game that can only be damaged by a particular beam. At most, they might have some kind of shield you'll need to bust through with either type, but even that's pretty rare. That means there's no more boring color matching, and so defeating enemies comes down to executing skill. And for the first time, these two beam weapons require ammo. That sounds like a risky concept, but in practice I found this to be a non-issue. Killing enemies and resupply crates alike will always net you the opposite ammo, and aside from a few boss fights, I never ran out. But it does change how you think about your weapons, now that there's a greater cost associated with using them. But it is still well thought out. If you need to open a particular door, you can still use an empty beam with a charge shot. And of course, you've still got the tried and true power beam, which works exactly as it did in Prime 1. Perhaps because of this change though, enemies tank less hits, and fights become less spammy. What it adds up to is that combat has more stakes and more variety. In addition to better designed drones, Prime 2 also features mini-bosses called Guardians that have taken on the characteristics of Samus's stolen weapons. So to recover the boost ball, you'll have to beat the boost Guardian. Wait a sec, I was trying to remember something a minute ago. We got an evil clone of our hero, in a game that's more challenging than its predecessor, with a stronger focus on narrative, featuring boss battles where corrupted enemies use the protagonist's own powers against them. Ah, yeah, now I remember. Don't worry, little buddy, I gotcha! Alright. Just like Prime 1 appropriated a lot of Super's defining elements, Prime 2 is more than a little reminiscent of course, Metroid Fusion. It's kinda surprising that Nintendo was okay with Retro putting their own spin on such a similar concept, given how much more recent Fusion was, but for all the same reasons that I didn't mind it in Prime, I don't mind it now. Retro injects more than enough creativity to justify it, and in fact they seemed even more confident adding new elements to the series with Echoes than they did before. But this is still a Metroid game, and I am still the kind of player who needs a lot of help in finding his way through a game like this. The Dark Agon Temple is sealed by 3 keys hidden throughout the Dark World. This was as far as I made it when I rented the game back in 04, and I'm not really surprised. Here's the thing, if you tell me the keys are in the Dark World, that's where I'm gonna look. Even after I wandered around for 30 minutes until the hint came up, I still had no idea how to actually get over there. And I feel I was actually punished for taking my time and scanning the environment. I knew I needed to get through that door, but scanning it told me I'd be able to break this gate. I thought there was an upgrade I needed to find. But no, as it turns out, the actual solution was just to jump up here and notice this brownish entrance blending into this brownish wall. Should that have been more obvious? I didn't talk about this much last time, but the map in the Prime games is something I really have trouble wrapping my head around. I spend a lot of time just poring over the map screen, trying to sort out where to go. Echoes is an improvement over the first games, given that you can finally see doors in rooms you're not highlighting. That drove me crazy last time. But it's still easy to get lost in a convoluted mess of geometric shapes, especially when multiple sections are placed over top of each other. It's like if I look at it wrong, my perception of the unshaded translucent 3D causes me to see the map upside down, and I wind up just spinning it in circles while my brain tries to recalibrate itself. That said, because rooms are designed so realistically, because of that third axis, I really don't know how much better it could get, especially in 2004. I think directly giving the player an adventure line to follow would be a step too far, but it might be nice if the player could set their own waypoints, or even color a series of rooms that they intend to follow. Geometry was never my strong suit, and I'm willing to concede that a lot of this might just be a me problem, but I always found myself willing to push through it with this game. Why? Well, largely because it's so much tougher than its predecessor. There's more to engage with, more to sink my teeth into, more to feel frustrated by, more to overcome. And when I overcame the first major boss, I was really surprised when this happened. This is a new upgrade for Echoes, the Dark Suit. I knew about Dark Samus as a separate character, but it's a testament to how little of a mark Echoes made that I had no idea this thing was even here. But I love the style of it. It's rustic and reminds me a bit of an old-timey robot. It's an example of Retro's willingness to introduce distinct elements to the series, and it fits this game to a T. Gameplay-wise, the Dark Suit makes the damage you get from the corrosiveness of the Dark World negligible. You'll still be on your toes there, but it's a lot more manageable now. From the dark to the light, it's a bit of a chore to hit this temple in both dimensions, but I return the energy to Light Aether. While the Agon Wastes might fail to make an impression with its looks, it achieves distinction by introducing all of Echo's important recurring elements. By the end of this first section, I was intimately familiar with the Dark World, I had both the light and dark beams, I understood how temple keys work, and after defeating this first boss, I even had the suit that Samus would turn out to wear for the majority of the game. And that kinda sets the stage. Samus did it once and she'll do it twice more. Go to a new area, find the Light Temple, update translation files to open new doors, fight a mini-boss or two to recover some powers, collect keys in the Dark World, fight the main boss, and restore the light to Aether. This approach could run the risk of being too linear or repetitive, but I rather believe the execution proves the opposite. Linearity is not inherently a bad thing. All Metroid games are linear to some degree. They all have a path the developers intend you to follow, and Echo's approach turns out to be much more in line with how progression was done in the 2D series. It's handled on a smaller scale, letting you traverse the ins and outs of one ecosystem before moving on to the next. giving you the opportunity to backtrack and seek out secrets, but not forcing you to do so. The first game impressed me with an immediate breadth by introducing its environments early and doled out new beam types as it went on. Prime 2, in contrast, gave me my combat options up front, but it kept me in a dull wasteland for about 5 hours. I don't really think that was necessary, but it paid off in a big way when I finally got to the Torvus Bog. It was so refreshing to see rain and water and an atmosphere and new enemy types and... oh, I love this. Yet it still got that same DNA, that same commitment to player immersion, that same avant-garde style, and some of the same enemies. Elements of Echoes get perhaps a bit too derivative of Prime 1. Even the bog itself, as much as I'd love to see it, was very evocative of the Talon 4 overworld. The Dark World influences still give it its own vibe, of course, and I guess it's not too different from the 2D series having similar enemies across planets. Maybe it'll ultimately make sense. Speaking of, though, here's something cool I didn't really give Prime enough credit for. Enemies in 3D games need to be more aggressive toward the player, since otherwise you can just go around them. How much does it say about Retro Studios that they went to the trouble of coming up with Phazon to justify that in-universe? Even against these guys, which keep disappearing on me. They jump into dimensional rifts and it's just irritating. But even that's done for a reason. I always get a kick out of it when a Metroid game endeavors to frustrate me just so it can make an upgrade more satisfying. And it's done here when you get the Dark Visor. Now you can track those guys, and also see platforms and switches hiding between dimensions. Same as the beams, it is kind of replicating a similar function from the first game, but putting a completely different and thematically appropriate spin on it. And it's about to get even better, but before we get into that, we need to talk about the boss of the bog, the Alpha Blog. To be more specific, the Alpha Blog highlights one of the more questionable things about Metroid Prime 2. In the first game, I was tripping over save points all the time, maybe even a little too frequently. Prime 2 tends to be much stingier with them, and here's an example of how this can land on the bad side of frustrating. You have to unlock these security gates to clear the way to the boss room, and you have to go through a lengthy set of dimension-hopping puzzles to do so. But once you solve this puzzle, there's no way to get back to the top of this chasm. That means you can't get back to the save room. The Alpha Blog is the toughest fight to this point, and bosses in this game tend to get even tougher near the end of their life. I died here, and it was disheartening to lose half an hour of progress. Now, it only took me about 10 minutes to get another shot since I knew what to do now, but the point stands. Echoes will cut you off from a save room before a tough fight, and that combined with how much harder it is in general, is at least a piece of the reason that it had less appeal than its predecessor. The reason you can't get up here is because you need an upgrade the Alpha Blog is guarding, the gravity boost. Where the gravity suit always let you move normally in water, the gravity boost is that aforementioned water jetpack. Honestly though, its uses are kind of limited, since you'll have already been through the bulk of Echo's water sections by the time you get it, but still, points for creativity. Speaking of creativity, it seemed like all too often in Prime 1, you'd hear that droning noise indicating a hidden item, you'd scan for a node, and you'd be told that it was time to spam all your weapons in order to hopefully eke out that upgrade. Prime 2 largely limits these physical blocks to blocking off progression, and its upgrade puzzles are way more integrated. They'll imaginatively use the environment, feature the gimmicks of the area you're in, and even test you on skills that you don't necessarily need anywhere else. I was praising Guasti for this stuff in AM2R, and now I'm seeing where he got the idea. Alas, here's where I was once again brought to a dead stop. Here's where I again had to wait for a hint, and then still didn't know what to do. The objective was behind this yellow door, so I thought I needed to find power bombs. I spent over an hour trying to figure this out, and you know what? This one was my fault. What I needed to do was think with portals, and use the Dark World to get where I needed to be. Honestly, in both the situations where this happened, it probably would have helped if I was on the Trilogy version, where I'd have been way more likely to look up. The bog's main boss, Chica? The bog's main boss, Chica, proved to be the toughest and most absorbing fight yet. Echo's bosses use their stage gimmicks more effectively within the fight. They utilize recent upgrades in a more dynamic way, and they even play with your expectations. Like here, I thought I got him, but I didn't. Chica sheds his skin and becomes completely different and way tougher. It's a standout Metroid boss, combining player skill with puzzle solving while keeping you on your toes. Chica took me over half an hour, but I never felt fatigued or bored because I was on edge and thinking and executing the whole time. Once I returned the bog's energy to Umas, he told me the final destination was in the cliffs, and my heart sank. Oh boy, here we go. Echoes is gonna limp to the finish and make me trudge through another naturalistic brown environment, but this time high up. Oh goody, oh boy, oh. Perhaps calling them cliffs was a misdirection. The Sanctuary Fortress turns out to be a high-tech temple, towering above a futuristic cityscape. Nothing in Prime, and heck, nothing in Metroid had ever looked like this. And I just adore this aesthetic. So much that I don't even care how oddly un-Metroid it feels to fall off a cliff and just reappear with 10 less energy points. I mean, I don't know how else they'd do it in a place like this. The fortress is guarded by robotic defensive buddies, corrupted by the Ing. There are bots where you have to use the morph ball to break them down, enormous guards that carry spectral shields, and itty-bitty drones capable of infecting Samus's system with a virus. Some of my favorite parts of Prime 1 were a few massive mechanical puzzles that utilize the full environment, and the fortress is just teeming with those. In conjunction with the light and dark worlds, combined with such a fantastically imaginative aesthetic, Echoes ain't limping home at all. On the contrary, Retro is really breaking out the full extent of their creativity, and this was the point where I was hooked. Another one of the most well-received parts of the first game was the morph ball, and Retro must have known it, because it too was expanded so much in Echoes. You get the boost ball a lot earlier this time, allowing Retro to build a lot more puzzles and set pieces around it, and put it to use in tons of creative ways. But you won't be fighting with the morph ball much, well, until suddenly you just are. The Spider Guardian kind of epitomizes all that's divisive about Echoes. When I first found him, I thought it was cool and clever, like it's about time we get to take down an entire boss as a morph ball. And it was unique. It's like a little diversion into a completely different kind of game, yet it fits perfectly within Echoes' framework. But then you get to the last room, and suddenly, you're expected to be able to perfectly position a ball on top of a hill and wait for your bomb to explode to bounce you up into a switch. Then you finally get that, and then you do it again, then hop up to another switch before the Spider Guardian loops around and deactivates all that work and just... At no point before this has either Prime game required you to be so precise or quick with the morph ball. The physics usually work fine for what they've been used for, but balancing a ball on top of a hill and timing yourself to be in just the right place is an exercise in frustration, and one the game hasn't trained you for. This was one of the few times I missed the trilogy version. They added a morph ball bounce by flicking the Wii remote in Prime 1 and 2. That would have made this fight so much more reasonable. Even with this stuff working against it, it's still a completely unique Metroid boss fight, and this late in the game, a boss should be tough. It should present new challenges. I could probably forgive the clunky physics and just enjoy the difficulty spike, if not for one other issue. Your last save point was a long way back, at least 20 minutes, and it was on the other side of an unskippable cutscene. And they freaking knew it! Once you jump down here, you can't get back up onto this ledge without the spider ball. So what could have been an interesting, memorable, and unique fight ends up feeling more like an excuse to pad out the game length. You aren't going to be good at this, you are almost certainly going to die here, and you're going to have to do it all again to get another shot. The weirdest thing is, after you beat the Spider Guardian, the game starts emphasizing combat and puzzle solving with the morph ball even more than before. There are other, much easier mini-bosses that use it. I mean, I know you get the spider ball from this fight, so it makes some sense. I just don't get why you'd put the hardest challenge first. And then, just as I was processing that, no. No. You want me to cross the whole map and go back to the lowest point of the bog? What? Why? I had assumed this guy was fired, but did Prime Scenario Designer sneak back into the office? But, okay. I was nervous, but Echoes had never asked me to do that before. And you know what? That alone makes a big difference. In doing this, I was moving through areas that I hadn't been to in ages, and because I hadn't been forced to do that over and over and over, I was inclined to uncover secrets that I couldn't have found before. But best of all, after I got down there and beat the Powerbomb Guardian, I was psyching myself up to traverse the entire map again when an elevator opened up that took me back to the Sanctuary, back into the fortress, and right back where I needed to be. This is backtracking done right. And once I got back there, I finally got to confront Dark Samus again. And, well, just like before, she's an anticlimactic fight. Her attacks are flashy, but it's not hard, it's just spammy. She tumbles down into the city, and I'm sure she's gone for good this time. This nets Samus her other new vision upgrade, the Echo Visor. It lets Samus see the sound waves of the environment, and is used to take down oral security systems. It's a unique upgrade, but much like Prime's thermal visor, it's ultimately just another way to open doors. But hey, at least you can see where the switches are this time, since you can follow the waves. Where here the subtitle was just Echoes, the Japanese name was the decidedly grittier, Dark Echoes, which gives the two visor upgrades more thematic cohesion. Hey, the screw attack finally makes the leap to 3D. While I had no idea about the dark suit, I weirdly did know about this, and I was still hyped to find it. I'd noticed these walls, and so I assumed that its use would be limited to those. But nope, those are just used for wall jumping once you've got the screw attack. It can be activated anytime, and it even swaps to a third-person perspective. Unfortunately, it is quite a bit clunkier than the morph ball. It can only go straight, you can't really gain height with it, you're limited to 5 consecutive jumps, and, well, the window for timing those jumps is gonna take some practice. But I played Metroid 2. You think wonky timing on a jump is gonna scare me? It's nowhere near as bad as that. I think Retro did intentionally nerf the screw attack to make it more of a movement tool than, well, an attack. Yeah, okay, much like the gravity boost, maybe they should have called this something else. The Sanctuary Fortress boss fight was probably my favorite in the game. This colossal mech called Quadraxis is like an Ultra Zord and has just as many weapons and phases. It puts all the abilities you've been collecting to use, and man, you know, I didn't know Retro had it in him to make such awesome boss battles. I've always thought of that as a weakness of the company. Of course, it helps because of how tough they are, and I love that stuff. I felt like I was barely scraping through, recovering energy, then coming back down to the brink over and over again. Something I loved about the 2D Metroids was how overpowered Samus felt by the end of the game, with weapons that froze enemies and tore through walls, a speed booster that gave her a ton of movement options, a jump that just caused her foes to explode. But in Metroid Prime, the player got more options, more ways to deal with things, instead of becoming stronger directly. That's not necessarily bad, mind you, it's just the result of Prime having a different emphasis. Echoes, on the other hand, is determined to have its cake and eat it too, because after thrashing Quadraxis, you get the Annihilator Beam. It's a combined shot of light and dark energy, carrying the properties of both. It even homes in on dark enemies, and can be used to power up the protective bubbles in the Dark World, drawing the Ing into the light where they can't survive. When Samus returns that last bit of stolen energy, Umos presents her with a final upgrade, the Light Suit. It feels wonderfully, beautifully earned, more so than, honestly, anything else in the series to this point, because it's forged from the very energy you've spent the entire game gathering. This power is what Samus has been working toward this whole time. Its design even resembles Luminoth artwork you saw near the beginning of the game. The light suit takes absolutely no damage from the Dark World, not even from these highly concentrated pools of dark energy. The suit also lets Samus ride light rails? Okay, I guess skateboarding was still a big thing in 04. Samus can shove it on up there and... Wait, no? I can fast travel between temples? Why does nobody love this game? Okay, it's not that big of a deal. It'd be better if you could just engage it anywhere instead of only at each temple, and the fact that temples are always behind these doors does limit its usefulness, and that's unfortunate. See, there's one final bit of energy holding Dark Aether together, and it's inside of the Ing Sky Temple, a temple that is locked by 9 keys. So, it's time to enjoy a hallmark of the Gamecube, a fetch quest that must be completed to unlock the final part of the game. Seriously, did Nintendo have some mandate during this era that games just needed to be padded to an arbitrary length? I guess it'd take the industry a few more years to learn that a longer game isn't always a better one. Aether is a world that was torn asunder by a lost war, and one way it's consistently communicated this to the player was by, well, featuring corpses throughout its maps. It starts with the Marines early on, but strewn across its landscape are Luminoth warriors, civilians, and even families. 10 keybearers were dispatched to seek out the keys, storm the temple, and end the war, but only one of them made it. The rest were killed by the Ing, and their remains can be found throughout the entire adventure. Their keys were taken back to the Dark World and stored in these bizarre living containers. So, here's what you gotta do. You find the Luminoth Keybearer, you find a portal, you go to the Dark World version of that same room the Luminoth Keybearer died in, find the container with the Dark Visor, and destroy it to get the key. This quest is narratively justified, and it doesn't feel tacked on the way that Prime's did. However, just because it's set up better doesn't make it any less obnoxious, especially since it actually manages to do some things worse. Despite the fact that I had scanned every keybearer as I'd been going, there was no way for me to see them on the map, and the hints I picked up in their logs were a lot more obtuse than Prime's more obvious clues. It also didn't seem to keep track of how many or even which keys I'd gotten in the logbook, though maybe I'm just put off trying to dive back into this clunky interface. More egregiously, there weren't really enough new elements in each of these locations. be a lot more justified if there were some challenges to overcome, some new enemies to fight, but it's all just stuff you've seen before. And because I had taken my time and cleared out areas as I went, it's not like there were a whole lot of upgrades I could find off the beaten path either. Worst of all, though, is that until you get the light suit, you can only pick up 2 of the 9 keys. The light suit had seemed like such a fantastic upgrade that you earned, but its only real function is to dive into purple pools to pick up keys. Now, you're so overpowered with the Annihilator that it is a little more fun than Prime, but it's still ultimately a chore, and it still would have been better to make this optional. I'm not even gonna pretend, there's no shame in using a guide to get you through stuff like this, and even with that, it took me an hour and a half. But hey, at least during the fetch quest, I found the Sonic Boom. No! Enough with the references. Save that for next season. When at last I unlocked the Sky Temple, I was surprised to find that the Dark World version of the hub I'd been to so many times was the same place upside down. That's hilarious. Imagine if the whole game was like this. The Dark World could have been so much more obnoxious. The first life form born along with Dark Aether, the Emperor Ing, ambushes Samus before she can even retrieve the energy. The first phase of the fight involves shooting away these tentacles in order to expose the eye in order to damage him. You may notice the problem here. I think Retro was a little too ambitious with their control scheme. Expecting a player to be able to fire at things that are above them when they can't look up and move at the same time is asking too much, and I found it hard to keep track of where I was. One more case where the trilogy probably fared better. The second phase is all about the Morph Ball, and I really do appreciate how much Echoes has put it to use, though this is ridiculously still nowhere near as tough as the Spider Guardian. Then the final phase is when the Emperor reveals its true form, and you have to strike at its heart with whatever beam counters it. Or just go OP and use the Annihilator beam. Why not? Really though, this is a long, difficult fight that'll put everything you've learned across both games to the test. Prime 2 really is, in terms of its difficulty, Metroid Prime for super players. But I wouldn't be having nearly as much fun if I wasn't being tested so hard. The Emperor Ing is killed, the last bit of energy is gathered, and... whoops. With no more energy to hold it together, Dark Aether is on the brink, which means it's time to go to a cutscene of Samus escaping. Wait, no, it's time for an epic escape scene, complete with a remix of the song for the original NES game. Oh, this is amazing! But it's admittedly gonna be more of an epic escape boss fight. Did you catch those purple particles when Samus soaked up the energy? Those have been used a few times throughout the game to signal the impending arrival of Dark Soul. You know, one of the good things about this game being so overlooked is that stuff like that hasn't been spoiled for me. Dark Samus has spent this whole game gathering Phazon, and it's corrupted her very form. If the Dark World is going down, she's determined to take Samus with it. And at long last, Dark Samus gives you a real fight, as she just barrages you with Kamehamehas of Phazon energy, forces you to track her movement through sonic waves, and eventually transitions into a being of pure Phazon. After spending so much of the game relying on the light and dark beams, the only way to strike back at her is to catch her blast with the tried and true power beam and hurtle it back. Dark Samus's form is overloaded, and much like the Metroid Prime that birthed her, she's no longer able to maintain cohesion. Dark Aether, along with the Ing, ceases to exist, and at long last the light has been restored to Aether. The Luminoth survivors who've been locked in stasis chambers honor the savior of their world. But Samus requires no festivities and wordlessly sets out for her next adventure. And having spent so long here, following their war, learning about their race, feeling a connection to this world and its people, it's a whole new kind of victory for this series. Up till now, Samus has vanquished things that threaten the universe, but it's always resulted in little more than wanton destruction. In Echoes, Samus finally gets to save people. At the start of this episode, I said that video game sequels have an unusually good track record of refining the kinks, of unshackling a developer's creative freedom, of being in many ways superior to their predecessors. I had always wondered why Metroid Prime 2 was, by just about every account, not a superior sequel. Well, I guess it's no secret by now. I think it absolutely was. It was ridiculous. I kept having this feeling like somebody at Retro traveled to the future, watched my last video, took a few notes, and made this game. I've got to level with you guys. I was dreading this game. I was putting it off. I had doubts that I would even be able to finish it, to the point that I considered combining Prime 2 and 3 into one video, which is why I was all the more blown away by just how much fun I was having. By giving you so much combat variety up front, and making the enemies that much more dynamic, it ensures that regardless of where you're going, the journey will be more mechanically interesting. By keeping your focus set to one place at a time, instead of spreading upgrades across the entire map, Echoes avoids the vast majority of the pointless zigzagging back and forth through the same boring hallways. In fact, all 4 of Aether's areas connect together, giving it the world cohesion that Talon 4 lacked. This effectively solves the fatal flaw of Metroid Prime. In all the ways that matter to me, Echoes is a superior sequel. In all the ways that matter to me. Despite the way that I've harped on about the game's progression, that really wasn't the make-or-break factor for most people when it came to Metroid Prime. The reason people loved it was because of how immersive it was, how varied and complete its world was, and even I can't deny that Prime 2 never reaches that same breadth. A lot of things that gave Prime such a solid, immersive world just aren't quite as strong here. Most of the music isn't nearly as memorable. The environment you'll be stuck in for the opening hours is so visually repetitive and boring. That combined with how much tougher the game was made it a lot less accessible, and many players, including me in 04, might have never made it anywhere close to the bog, let alone the Sanctuary. Prime 2 is a game that hangs its hat on its challenge, and it gets more cohesive, expansive, and creative as it goes along. And once again, some of this just comes down to me and my preferences. A lot of this really might be, it was harder and had better combat and less wandering around, so Josh had more fun. When I played Metroid Prime, all I had to compare it to was what I liked about the 2D games, and it wasn't a favorable look. But because of Prime 1, I went into Echoes knowing what to expect, knowing to take my time, knowing how to approach a game like this. I've beaten Zero Mission more than a dozen times since its episode came out, because it's made to be replayable. But Echoes is more contemporary. It focuses on an epic, lengthy campaign that the developers are expecting most players will experience one time. But the reason I grew so bored with Prime was not because it had a long campaign. I was frustrated with the methods it used to stretch out that playtime to such a ridiculous degree. Just to make sure, I even went back to it with the Gamecube version and just couldn't stand to grind through all that tedium again. Prime to me ended up less than the sum of its parts, undermining what could have been a game I'd have loved. I never would have expected it, but Echoes is that game, and it has made me a fan of 3D Metroid. It's built on the same engine, the same approach, and even a lot of the same weaknesses, but the way it's executed plays to the strengths of what I love about this medium. The same as a lot of people could overlook Prime's flaws because it gave them what they wanted out of a game, I can overlook some of the sequel's flaws because of what I came to love about it. That's why I decided that Metroid Prime 2 deserves such an appropriately epic amount of coverage, because it's a sequel that spent too long lost in the shadow of what was, to my tastes, an inferior predecessor. It's my hope that by giving it this level of critique, I might be able to get more people to give it a shot, or at least get the conversation going. If you've never been able to get into 3D Metroid, and you've only tried the first Prime, maybe you're like me, and maybe you'll find that the sequel turns out to be more what you're looking for. I don't know when I'll go back to Aether, but I know I will, and when I do, I will be faster, I will be better, I will sharpen my skill, and Metroid Prime 2 Echoes will be even more rewarding. Please don't feel obligated to, but if you're in a position to support this channel on Patreon, then for just $1, you can see the Geek Critique for Metroid Prime 3 right now, a week early. For $3, you can binge the entire completed season, and my milestone bonus this time will be for a game that nearly killed a franchise, Metroid Other M. Thanks for watching, you keep geekin', I'll keep critiquin'.